right. It is my pleasure to introduce our first Terry Talk of the morning. Our first Terry Talk is from Roxana Danescu. Did I do that okay? Danescu? Excellent. She's a dermatologist, and she got her PhD in Russ's lab. And she's also, she has all kinds of interesting things about her. And by the way, she's a great Twitter follow. And one of the things that struck me that I thought I would mention is that she's a Soros Fellow for New Americans. And that paid for her medical training. So without further ado, Roxana.
Hi everyone, my name is Roxana Danescu, as was mentioned, and this is a tweetable talk. And today I'm going to be talking about improving diversity and inclusion as an antidote to scientific bias. So what exactly is the problem that we're talking about? When we look at the numbers, we find that in science, in medicine, in engineering, we have a diversity issue. Even though African Americans make up 12% of the population, they represent only 0.7% of faculty in biology. And even though Hispanic people represent 16% of the population, they only make up 3% of faculty in biology. And I also listed chemistry there as well. We know that in STEM fields, we have an issue with gender. Among engineering faculty in total, only 15% are women. And then when we look at the breakdown by race, we see that even a smaller percentage of those women represent sort of underrepresented minoritized populations. But this is not a problem that we just see in science. I know many of you guys have colleagues or are in medicine, so it's actually something that we see across the fields. In medicine, only 6% of medical graduates in the year 2015 identified as Black or African American. And as I mentioned before, in the US population, they represent 12% of people. Only 5% of medical graduates identified as Hispanic, but they represent 16% of the US population. So you may be sitting in your seat and you may wonder, why should I care? What does this have to do with me? What does this have to do with my science? What does this have to do for our community at large? Well, I would say that each of us has a unique perspective to bring to our science, a mix of obstacles that we overcame, and privileges that we all have and should acknowledge that helped us get where we are today. There is a lot of data that has shown that diverse groups make better decisions and are more innovative. And of course, we all want to have more innovative science. And I'll address this later, and I know this is a topic of interest to many. We know that there are biases in medical and scientific studies. Improved diversity can help combat that early on. So I just wanted to talk about the perspective that I bring, recognizing that there are some experiences that I have that are unique, and there are some experiences that I've had that have given me a lot of privilege. So in the center is a photo of my mom. Both my mom and dad were born in Iran, a country that has never been in the news recently. Growing up there, it was a more, at that time, sort of westernized existence. After the Islamic Revolution, both my parents belonged to a minority religion that was heavily persecuted. People were killed. People were basically, and this is true to this day, banned from higher education. So no college, no graduate school, no medical school. And so because of that, each of my parents made the decision to immigrate to the United States independently. They met here when they were about college aged. They came here with nothing. They faced a lot of struggles. My mom actually came here during the Iran hostage crisis and was told by numerous people made comments to her. And she tried to explain, she was somebody who actually faced a lot of discrimination there. And then I also bring the more recent perspective as a new mom. I have a toddler. And I've become acutely aware of what is called the mommy tax that women sort of face in science. I've been very open all the time about my career aspirations, my goals in science, but no one had ever said anything to me, such as what happened recently, where a young clinician scientist faculty member that I actually look up to said something like, "Well, you're a great wife and now you're a great mother. What else could you want?" So you think these kinds of comments don't get said anymore, and I was sort of shocked, and I'm not sure that he meant it the way that it came off. I'm not really sure what he meant, but the truth of the matter is that I realized that there was this sort of new undercurrent of comments that I was hearing that happened after I had a kid. So these are my perspectives. I, of course, have a lot of privileges as well. My parents worked very hard. They helped support me in my career aspirations. So I want to acknowledge that I also come with a set of privileges, and I don't represent all of the different experiences that different people have, which is why I rely on my colleagues to help me out and to understand all the different perspectives that exist. So as I've mentioned, a diversity of perspectives improves decision making and outcomes. And last night when I was looking and perusing through the studies, I found so many I wasn't sure which ones to include, but I put 2 in here. So one study looking at 16 healthcare studies demonstrated improved patient outcomes and satisfaction scores with more diverse teams. And then a study looking at across 1,700 companies found that companies with higher levels of diversity had higher innovation revenues. So then the question becomes, what obstacles do minoritized populations face? And I use this word very specifically. It is a word that I've sort of learned about through leadership diversity training. I use the word minoritized because a population could be in the minority, so to speak, but hold power. And the other thing is minoritized also suggests that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that population. It's actually society doing something actively by putting prejudice or bias onto that population. So that's the word that I'm going to be using throughout this talk. So microaggressions. So this is popular in the media, and you've probably heard about it. You may know about it. The thing about microaggressions is people may think they seem innocent, but the people who face microaggressions have to deal with it on such a regular basis that it becomes quite irritating. There is a wonderful YouTube video that compares microaggressions to mosquito bites. So one mosquito bite, that's annoying, but if you're getting bitten by 20 mosquitoes every single day, then that sort of becomes more onerous. The other thing about microaggressions is that they're sort of in the eye of the beholder. So that means that all of us at some point have probably said something to somebody else that they perceived sort of as a microaggression or as harmful to them. And the best thing to do when that happens is not to try to, over-explain. It's to try to acknowledge that this person is coming from an experience where what you have said to them may be demonstrated to be hurtful. Unconscious and overt bias. So there's been numerous interesting studies around this. So given the same identical resume for a lab manager, where one is named John and the other is named Jennifer, both male and female faculty rate John as being more competent, rate John as being more likely the person they want to give the job to, and also offer John a higher salary. This same experiment was done using ethnic names, and as you can imagine, had sort of similar results, where ethnic names were more penalized. And then, of course, there's more overt sexism, racism, ableism, anti-LGBTQ sentiments. And one example I would give is that I have had colleagues who are in medicine, and I have not had this experience, so that speaks to a privilege that I have, where they have been asked multiple times while in the hospital, while wearing scrubs, sometimes while even wearing their name badge, if they are the janitor, if they are coming in to clean the room. And you can imagine that that does not feel good. That does not sort of contribute to a feeling of belonging. And the reason that I bring up these issues is that diversity is important. I think we all care, many of us care about diversity, improving the diversity in our field. But if you don't have inclusion, then diversity fails. And the topics that I was discussing before speak to inclusion, speak to the things that make people not feel welcome, not feel a part of the community. So inclusion means that individuals from minoritized populations are treated like they belong and that they have a voice. And there is this excellent commentary in Science which had this quote that I pulled up. Transitioning from diversity to inclusion requires acknowledging that structural bias and social justice affect scientists as people, and that this has consequences for the science that they do. So these issues are not really divorced from our science, and I'm going to talk about how these structural society issues can manifest in our science. So probably a lot of you are familiar with this slide, which is from a paper in Cell looking at GWAS studies and what groups have been targeted in GWAS studies. And when you look at all of the individuals in the GWAS catalog, you find that 70% of the individuals that are in GWAS studies represent European descent populations. But the issue is that genetic variation relevant to disease, pharmacogenetics, whatever your phenotype of interest is, found in one population is not always translatable to other populations. Even if it's not just a tag SNP, even if you have, the causal variant, it's not always translatable. For instance, in warfarin, there was a study in New England Journal of Medicine using the CYP variants and VKORC1 variants that are most prevalent in the European descent populations, and they applied it to African descent populations. They used an algorithm that was more targeted towards European descent populations, and then they made erroneous conclusions about how well pharmacogenetic prediction works in African American or in African descent populations. This is an issue because you know that there's probably actually variants in African descent population that are important. And you need to study those to be able to find those in order to be able to have fair predictive algorithms. I will give a quick aside. This is something that I see a lot more in medicine, where race and genetic ancestry become conflated. Race is a social construct and does not tell us about biology. And I've seen this happen in medicine where people walk into the room, make an assumption about the background of the individual, and then make assumptions about their underlying biology, their underlying pharmacogenetic risk, their underlying genetic risk for diseases. And that's not really fair because you're not really looking at their genome. You're making a lot of assumptions that don't translate. There are some assumptions you can make because of the fact that race is a social construct about some of the stressors they may have faced, that individual may face in society because of the fact that we have unconscious and overt bias in our society. But we should really be careful to not conflate these two things, especially if you're on Twitter and on the Twitter community. There is a contingent of people, some of them with very large followings, some of them with the verified blue check marks, meaning that they're part of a news media organization, who really like to take scientific studies and completely post them out of context, and of course their readers are not going to go back to the original research, and try to make points about racial superiority. I've seen this happen a lot more recently, and I think it's something that we should just be aware of. So biases in our algorithms, and I've just pulled a couple examples. I'm sure people can think of many more. So AI papers in dermatology, they don't contain diverse skin types. Google posted a preprint using one of the largest cohorts of patients in dermatology to build an AI algorithm. They had 0% of the darkest skin type, which is skin type 6. And they only had 2.6% of the second darkest skin type, which is skin type 5. That's an issue. There was an AI, this was recently in the news, there was an algorithm that was used for allocating healthcare, and they found that it was much less likely to refer Black people than white people to support programs to patients with complex needs. And the only reason that this was sort of figured out is that the researchers actually got their hands on the algorithm, were able to test it, and discovered that the algorithm used healthcare resource utilization, money spent, as one of the features. And Black people had less utilization because of many different reasons, one being like having access to resources, and the other is mistrust. We have many studies that have shown that because of the history medicine had with experimentation on certain minoritized populations, there is distrust, and so they might be less likely to seek care, less likely to spend money in the medical system. And then a risk assessment software that was used to predict which criminals might reoffend, when they looked longitudinally at the results, found that it mislabeled Black people at twice the rate of white people. And so these are algorithms, some of them, not all of them, but some of them had been in use. The healthcare one was, they said, it probably affected about 200 million people. And the question becomes, why didn't someone think about these issues of bias earlier? We have data that basically has shown that when you improve diversity, when you have diverse teams, you can catch these issues earlier. You can wait before things are implemented because those people who care about these issues are going to bring them up. They found as the number of women in medical research increased in the 1980s and 1990s, there was increased attention given to women's health issues, heart disease, breast cancer, and autoimmune diseases. There have been interesting case studies done that when you have researchers who are part of a minoritized population, they can help set the agenda and the methodology when they are partnering with their own communities, especially given the history of distrust between researchers and certain populations. Furthermore, researchers who are part of a minoritized population, when they're part of algorithm building, they are going to probably bring up earlier, hey, does our data set have bias? Does our algorithm have bias? Is this something that we can test before it goes out into the world and starts causing issues? And of course, people wonder, what can we do about this? That is probably an entire series of talks, but just a couple comments on that front. Listening to your minoritized colleagues and students and be an ally in addressing the issues that they're facing. You may not have experienced some of the experiences that they have, and so listening openly and trying to understand what their experiences are and asking them what you can do to make things better for them is important. Particularly because there is something known as the diversity tax, meaning that when an individual of a minoritized population brings up an issue, then it can actually cause them to face a penalty in their career when it is compared to having an ally bring up the same issue. Ask your institutions to take diversity and inclusion seriously, not just lip service. Join your diversity and inclusion committees, again, helping battle the diversity tax, because if minoritized populations are the only ones who are being asked to sit on these diversity committees and do all this work and do all the mentorship, that's taking up their valuable time that they could be writing papers, submitting grants. So it's all of our responsibility to do this, not just those individuals. Mentor and sponsor minoritized colleagues and students. Mentors provide advice. Sponsors help advocate and push careers forward. And then, of course, recognize and check your own unconscious and overt biases. And so, for instance, in our dermatology, when we are doing resident selection, they have started doing sort of this unconscious bias training right before the interview season starts, so that people can sort of check in their minds what are some of the biases that they carry. At Stanford Medical School, where I sat on the admissions committee, one thing we also did the same thing. We did training on conscious and unconscious bias, and we had a committee that I felt was trusted one another and would call each other out if we felt like there was something going on. And I think the thing to do is to just recognize that we all have these conscious and unconscious biases because of the fact of what the media portrays, what society portrays, So it's something that we can all acknowledge in ourselves without shame, because that's the way that we tackle it. So I do have some time to take some questions. I wanted to thank the PSB organizers, the PSB Travel Award, my mentors and sponsors, Drs. Terry Klein and Russ Altman, as well as the Leadership in Education and Advancing Diversity training at Stanford, which is a program for residents who are interested in these issues.
I would really like to thank you for spending the time to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the way you have. I think it's really important to be pointing it out constantly. I was just thinking, a lot of what you said, except for the right at the end, it was really more about the problems than the solutions. Right. And that's the state of the game, I guess. Just a couple of other thoughts about potential solutions, and you touched a little on it, but we've just done a study recently in our own institution which suffers from this quite significantly, and it was concerning inclusion. So it was actually working with the administration to using the skill sets that we have, not necessarily applied in a biomedical way, but to actually analyze data to look at inclusion. And what we found, for example, is that minorities who start off with exactly the same set of criteria, GPA and so forth, as undergraduates, by the time they graduate, whereas they have actually dropped off while the majorities have actually gone up, which speaks certainly to inclusion. And it's that kind of data that actually really gets the attention of leaderships and organizations. And we can contribute to that. So that was one thought by virtue of the skill set we have. The other thought I have, which we have venues for professional development for our field. And I think there's not enough said about this within those venues. So I was just thinking, for example, I've been involved with this 10 Simple Rules series that some people probably know about. It's in PLOS Comp Bio. We've never done one on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I would certainly invite you to write one.
Yeah, I think those are some great ideas. Some other solution ideas I wanted to throw in just from our experience is sort of recognizing that because of experiences people have had, even if they appear to come to an institution on the same foot, there can be other factors. So in the Ivy League schools, they found that first-generation college students had a more difficult time navigating the system. No one had sort of taught them, you can ask your professor for an extension. You can ask your professor, you can go into office hours and have a conversation. And so actually, students self-organized and created an organization for first gen in Ivy League schools where they would get together and share resources with one another. And I think it's great that they self-organize, but I think, as you mentioned, institutions should recognize that there are factors that are in the way and can help. In terms of sort of admissions, one thing that Stanford Medical School did is that we had a holistic admissions process that looked at distance traveled, which is kind of an important metric. Where did you start and what did you do with it during your academic career when we're deciding about who we're admitting? And so if you had to basically work extra to support your family and you didn't have connections to top scientists, but you worked really hard, we're not going to expect that you are going to necessarily have the same productivity as somebody who has a faculty parent who's been working in your parent's best friend's lab since you were in middle school churning out papers. Like, we recognize that there's differences, and so we actually cared a lot about that distance traveled because it said something about motivation, about grit. And in science, there's a lot of failure, in medicine as well, and so those kind of things are important to also think about.
So Dana Crawford, Case Western Reserve University, excuse me. So I just wanted to maybe amplify something that you touched on a little bit as your experience as a woman in academia, particularly with a new toddler, is attrition. And so in that, for those few women and or groups from underrepresented populations that do have PhDs or MDs and are in the field, there is much discussion about the leaky pipeline. or people leaving the field, not feeling supported. And I did want to commend PSB and the organizers. So one of the support systems, of course, is giving speaking opportunities to diverse faculty members and trainees, because that really is real currency for tenure and promotion. And so I would like to see that, of course, expand here at PSB as well as other scientific organizations. So it's not just, of course, the admissions process at universities and making sure people are granted the degrees that they have earned, but also to ensure that the fields that these scientists are working in really do support them throughout the life cycle of the career of a biomedical researcher.
Yeah, and I just want to comment, it's great because there are a lot of fantastic mentors and sponsors at PSB who are very dedicated to that issue.
I just want to thank you for this presentation. It's very good. It's very needed. And as far as the, I just want to make a comment about what maybe people can consider as it relates to solutions. And it's almost like, I guess, hope I can say it right, is that individuals who are really interested and committed to helping solve this, and they are wonderful individuals, there's almost an inherent view of minorities as the other without even realizing it. And so minority individuals, in addition to being the successful and competent professionally, there's a second barrier of having to overcome that otherness. And so if people that interact and associate and collaborate with minorities can just somehow be aware of the otherness aura that they exude, could be very helpful also, I think. You can comment on that as you see fit.
Yeah, I think that's a conversation actually in the group that we've had in the Leadership Education and Advancing Diversity program, because everybody, that's what, again, when I was speaking about having everybody involved, when I look at that room, it's actually mostly people who belong to some of the underrepresented populations. And we each of us have different experiences in how that touches us. And we've had discussions around just this othering. And in fact, I would say that currently in society, unfortunately, I feel like the othering has gotten even stronger from the outside. So there's actually increased pressure from the outside as well, and how the news media is portraying certain groups of people. And I think that's actually made things, even though there have been some step forward, I think there's actually been a lot of challenges, because now, when you watch the news, you're hearing about people making comments that are just sort of inappropriate and, quite frankly, overtly racist, and it's happening more often than I feel like I noticed maybe 10 years ago. And I think that is also something that we need to acknowledge, that there has been this force in our society in general, which has also been contributing. So it's not only the stress that you're feeling at work, but it's the stress that you're feeling when you go home and you're reading Twitter feeds and you're hearing these things when you're like, why are people thinking that it's okay to say these things? It doesn't feel good, and it sort of contributes to the mental stress and anguish of our colleagues. But actually, I've seen this a lot with patients too. Patients have shared that too, that like the larger forces in society have contributed to their disease flares, to the stress they feel, to feeling like they don't belong. And so it's sort of become, in my opinion, more pervasive and requires us to be more aware. So thank you for bringing that up.
Hi, I'm Lisa Tucker Kellogg from the Duke NUS Medical School in Singapore. And I wanted to give a quick remark about how pervasive and profound societal reading of race and gender can be. After moving from a majority white culture to a majority non-white culture, I was given race-based privilege that I wouldn't be able to be at that university unless I were faculty. And suddenly everyone treated me as faculty the moment I walked into a room. And I realized how different it was from every time I had walked in a room in the United States and been taken for either a secretary or a graduate student, every single time for 12 years, and then to spend years being treated like, well, on the one hand, no one will just chat me up casually because I'm supposed to be powerful. But on the other hand, to be recognized as powerful the moment I walk into a room has changed almost everything about my career trajectory, and has changed almost everything about what it means to network with strangers, because the first 3 steps of introducing myself don't need to be done.
Thank you for sharing that powerful comment.